So our keynote speaker is already waiting for us. Actually, his local time is 1 a.m., right? So I guess he's a work up, yeah, from his sleeping. So we really, truly sorry for him. So, but it's not our fault because we tried to invite him, right? But because of COVID-19, yeah, he just decided to attend online. So also I feel sorry for Gam because you missed quite a precious session, right? While you're sleeping, because because one of clips, actually we saw some clips about refugee, and actually one of refugee from the interview, she just mentioned some important sentence, really summarizing your presentation today. Like everything is a movement. It's said by one of the refugee, yeah, from the documentary by one of our presenter. So actually, when we before planning this conference, actually our research team was reading many important publication about migration, and actually we came across Thomas Nail's book, The Figure of Migrant. So after reading that one, so we decided to invite him as our keynote speaker. And we didn't expect he accept yes, but yeah, he willingly, yeah, decided to participate in our conference as a keynote speaker. So have you heard one of your translated book in Korea?
Yeah.
So as a, yeah, one of his famous book, Being and Motion, yeah, is the Korean translated book, but rather than that one, we read The Figure of Migrant together, but its main topic is quite overlap, so we really impressed by your book. So let me see. So in your proceeding, actually, Thomas agreed to provide a full paper for you. So while he's talking, you also can cross-check with the proceeding to follow up the contents. So at the end of the page, we also provided some short introduction about his career. So he's a professor of philosophy at the University of Denver now. So his research has focused on philosophy of movement and mobility. So yeah, there's a full explanation about his career, but I think it's maybe better to let him start. Yeah, first without any hesitation, right? So yeah, I will give the mic to you.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Is the audio all right? Okay, well, yeah, thanks. I wish I could be there with everybody. Thanks for coming to this talk, and thank you for the invitation to contribute something to the conference over Zoom. It is a little late, but I'm feeling okay. I'm feeling awake. Yeah, so maybe I should say just a little bit about the background, sort of how I came to the project, and then try to give some sort of introductory remarks about the nature of migration and movement as I've kind of proceeded to think quite broadly about it. I'm a philosopher by training, so I kind of come at it from a perspective of political theory and philosophy. And unfortunately, most political philosophers, especially around 2010, when I was working on this, starting to work on the research, political philosophers really didn't have a lot to say about migration and borders, and that seems hard to believe. But this is prior to the European migration crisis and a number of other things. It's not like there are no philosophers who had said anything about it, but it wasn't a main part of political theory. I think in the last 10, 15 years, it's certainly become more of a central topic for political philosophers to deal with. But at the time I was dealing with it, there was definitely a lack. And so I ended up reading a lot of things in sociology and various things in migrations. As you all know, the study of migration is a very interdisciplinary field. It's overwhelming to try to keep up with all the different disciplines and all the different ways of approaching migration. So I come at it from one way of coming at it. So I spent the year 2009, 2010 in Toronto, in Canada, sort of doing a Fulbright scholarship there to work with the migrant justice group, No One Is Illegal, for the year. So I did activist work with them and read a lot of stuff on migration. And so a lot of what I'm writing about sort of comes out of my perspective as a migrant justice activist working in Toronto, trying to think about a lot of different problems, talking with other activists, and also trying to engage academic conversations across disciplines. One of the main things that I've come away with or come out of this thinking about migration is that I think a lot of migration studies is often very specific, and historically it doesn't go super far back. It goes back as far as about, you know, when we actually have some kind of demographic record keeping about migrations, and even the term migrant, you know, I mean, this is a historical kind of construction that happens when human beings start being counted outside of nation states. They get this term migrant, and then they get counted as that. But actually, the way that I was thinking about migration was quite broader, going back to, you know, the earliest human beings in the Paleolithic. I mean, human beings have been migrating for a very long time. And if you think about migration in a much longer historical period, I think what it shows is there's a real breadth of the way that major different types of migrants have been produced, the circulation of humans on the planet and their designation as certain types of people, and how they've been mobilized to accomplish and reproduce certain forms and patterns of society over time, over the course of human history, really. So what I've tried to do, so in The Figure of the Migrant and my book Theory of the Border, I've tried to kind of give an account of some of the major shifts in thinking about migrants, and I'll introduce some of those to you today. But I do have a paper a little bit. If you want to follow along, you can. There are probably some digressions that I have, but I will. I'm gonna read a little of the paper now. Oh yeah. Well, I think we'll get to that, to my main thesis really in just a second. We live in a world of borders. Territorial, political, juridical, and economic borders of all kinds quite literally define every aspect of social life in the 21st century. Despite the celebration of globalization and the increasing necessity of global mobility, there are more types of borders today than ever before in history. I mean, just as an aside, if you think it's about 31 or 32 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, this moment in which the West, you know, was, oh, the wall is coming down and we're going to see no more borders and we're going to see the free movement of capital. And exactly what we see is the opposite. There are more borders now than ever before. There was not a decrease in borders after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but now there's over 70 major borders in the last, 31, 32 years since the fall. So we've only witnessed an enormous historical expansion of borders, secured borders around the world. In the last 20 years, but particularly since 9/11, hundreds of new borders have emerged around the world. Miles of new razor wire fences, tons of new concrete security walls, numerous offshore detention centers, biometric passport databases, and security checkpoints of all kinds in schools, airports, and along various roadways in the world. Contemporary social mobility is everywhere divided. It is corralled by territorial fences around our homes, institutions, and countries. It is politically expelled by military conflicts, border walls, and ports of entry. It is juridically confined by identification documents, visas, passports, detention centers and prisons, and an entire scheduling matrix of bordered time zones. Above all, it has become economically stretched, expanded, and contracted to fit the rapid fluctuations of market, police, security, and informational borders that now appear and disappear at any point, whatever in the social fabric. In this paper, I'd like to put forward two interrelated theses at the core of The Figure of the Migrant and Theory of the Border. The first is that borders and migrants are socially constitutive. That is, they are not simply passive effects produced by top-down structures of power. This is a historical and conceptual point. Before there were states, there were migrants and various processes of bordering that produced the state in the first place. So just as an aside, this is one of the things that in the literature to me was really stood out, was that most of the political theorists or even sociologists that were thinking about migrants very much thought about migration as the exception to the rule, that the rule was citizens and nation states, and that migrants were sort of this, difficult, small part of the whole process. And I think that's completely the opposite. I don't think that it's that migration and migrants are somehow secondary to the process of the nation state. Human beings have always been migrant, and it's only historically that those things have been bordered, only that they've been named, that they've been dispossessed, that they've been expelled and removed from their land. So the historical process, migration is the transhistorical constant, and it's nation states that are the relative crisis with respect to migration, not migrants that are the crisis with respect to the nation state. So when I say constitutive, I mean that I think migration in all of its aspects, both economically and culturally, actually is constitutive. It makes the society what it is. It reproduces that society. And that is really not what I had found in the literature at the time, but really the point that I wanted to make when I looked at the issue more historically. So social borders are therefore the material and kinetic conditions required for the reproduction and expansion of society itself. In this sense, borders and migrants precede and exceed the state. Without them, there is no territory, no nation, no state. The cost, however, of continuously maintaining and even expanding social borders is precisely the expulsion of a migrant surplus. Migrants, for example, reside within states, provide them with constitutive social labor, and yet suffer numerous marginalizations along territorial, political, juridical, and economic borders. Migrants are made to perform and reproduce the very social formations that make possible the citizen. So it's not that the migrant is like this other thing that's just the residue or the failed citizen. It's actually that citizenship is only possible because of migration, because of the migrants that sustain and reproduce the societies in which there are citizens. The citizen then tries to hide its colonial past by declaring itself its own origin and foundation of law. And then, of course, there's, anti-immigration laws that are passed, while at the same time, migrants are sustaining and reproducing the societies that are criminalizing them. The second thesis is that migrant positions are today being rapidly multiplied, in part because so are borders. The more borders there are, the more ways there are to be migrants, the more kinds of migrants there are: climate migrants, environmental, economic, cultural, all various kinds of diaspora. The two must be thought together as part of the same social regimes of mobility, that is, migration borders. The more ways social mobility is sliced up, or dimensions or aspect of migration there will be in a social body. As such, migration, that is sort of the paradox, right? If, one way to, the more laws there are that are criminalizing migration, the more migrants there will be, because the more laws you define. Now, the less laws you have, the less migrants you're going to have. So there's this kind of legalistic, amplification. The more, states crack down on immigration, the more migrants they find. And then so it looks, because they're counting them more and they're criminalizing them, that there are more migrants. A migrant is a mobile intersection between various synchronous and competing borders that vary historically and geographically. The migrant is not just someone who crosses an international border, but someone who is continuously located at a position of intersection between multiple border regimes: territorial, political, legal, and economic. So these are the two theses. The paper is divided up into two parts, each one defending each of the theses, and what I think is novel about a movement-oriented, or what I call a keynote political definition of borders and migrants. I think I'm going to get through the first thesis, and if I start to run out of time, I'll just sort of quickly summarize the second one about borders. So the first one's about migration. and borders as being socially constitutive. And then if I have time, I'll sort of give a case study. Most of my kind of empirical research is about the US-Mexico border. And I know many of you work on different border areas, so it'd be interesting to see sort of overlaps and differences between them. But I'll just give an example of what a kind of movement-oriented or kenopolitical perspective can highlight in studying borders and migration. So the first thesis is that migrants and borders are socially constitutive. This is the case in short because societies are themselves defined by a continual movement of circulation, expansion, and expulsion that relies on the mobility of borders and migrants to accommodate its social expansion and contraction. The migrant is the political figure who is socially expelled or dispossessed to some degree as a result or as the cause of their mobility. We are not all migrants, but we are possibly becoming migrants. At the turn of the 21st century, there are more regional and international migrants than ever before in recorded history. Today, there are over 1 billion migrants. And at each decade, the global percentage of migrants and refugees grows. Climate change in particular may cause international migration alone to double over the next 40 years. Political theory has yet to take this phenomenon seriously. If we're going to take the figure of the migrant seriously as constitutive and not derivative, as a derivative figure of Western politics, we need to change the starting point of political theory. Instead of starting with a set of pre-existing citizens, we should begin with the flows of migrants and the ways they've circulated or sedimented into citizens and states in the first place, as well as emphasizing how migrants have constituted a counterpower and alternative to state structures. This requires, first of all, that we take seriously the constitutive role played by migrants and borders before the 19th century and give up the liberal fetish of the nation state. In this way, we'll be able to see how the nation state itself was not the origin, but the product of migration and bordering techniques that existed long before the nation state came on the scene. Second of all, and based on this, we need to rethink the idea of political inclusion as a fundamentally kinetic process of circulation, not just as a legal, formal, economic, or other kinds of status. In other words, instead of a formal concept of inclusion or exclusion of insiders/outsiders, it might be better to think of a material kind of inclusion that thinks about circulation and recirculation, in which inclusion is definable by livable patterns of social mobility, in which everyone who's affected has a say in the structures of mobility that affect them. One way to think about this kenopolitical thesis and the constitutive role played by borders and migrants is as a radicalization of Karl Marx's theory of primitive accumulation. Marx develops this concept from a passage in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, where Adam Smith says the accumulation of stock must, in the nature of things, be previous to the division of labor. Meaning basically that, Adam Smith, it's like, well, how did society become so unequal and so divided? And why is it that some people have to sell their labor to live and others don't? And Adam Smith just kind of basically just hand waves and gestures to that. Oh, there was already like a prior kind of division. There was already an accumulation of stock such that some people had things and others didn't. But that for Marx hides completely the fact that primitive accumulation was established through massive structures of systematic violence and dispossession. In other words, before humans can be divided into owners and workers, there must have already been an accumulation such that those in power could enforce the division in the first place. The superior peoples of history, according to Adam Smith, naturally accumulate power and stock and then wield it to perpetuate the subordination of their inferiors. For Smith, this process is simply a natural phenomenon. Powerful people already had accumulated stock as if from nowhere. And for Marx, of course, this story of how that stock gets accumulated and how people get dispossessed is, in fact, the whole point, is that capital relies on the constant dispossession of migrants. For Marx, however, this quote is perfectly emblematic of the historical obfuscation of political economists regarding the violence and expulsion required for those in power to maintain and expand their stock. Instead of acknowledging this violence, political economy mythologizes and naturalizes it, just as the citizen-centric nation state does politically. So there's a similar story, both economic and political, the story that liberals, liberal nation states tell themselves about how natural it was that things fell the way they did, when we know it's not natural at all. We know it's the process of colonialism, of historical colonialism, that has distributed things the way they are, such that the patterns and flows of migration are the way they are. For Marx, the concept of primitive accumulation has a material history. It is the pre-capitalist condition for capitalist production. In particular, Marx identifies this process with the expulsion of peasants and indigenous people from their land through enclosure, colonialism, and anti-vagabond laws in 16th century England. Marx's thesis is that the condition of the social expansion of capitalism is the prior expulsion of people from the land and from their legal status under customary law. Without the expulsion of these people, there is no expansion of private property, and thus no capitalism. I think this is just absolutely, this is a very central idea. I mean, Marx is writing in the 19th century, but I find this idea to be pretty much exactly what's going on today, with a lot of other dimensions. But this aspect is absolutely central. The way that capitalism and colonialism have produced produced a migration crisis, as if it was somehow the migrants that were to blame for the problem. While some scholars argue that primitive accumulation was merely a single historical event in the 16th to the 18th century, others argue that it plays a recurring logical function within capitalism itself. And that's certainly where I fall on that. I think it's something that keeps on going. It's not like colonialism happened once upon a time. It continues to happen, and capital does the same thing over and over again. In order to expand, capitalism today still relies on non-capitalist methods of social expulsion and violence. So my idea in the figure of the migrant is a bit, it's sort of based on this, it's similar, but the term I use is expansion by expulsion. So this is meant to capture the fact that it's not just capital and capitalists that engage in this kind of violence and dispossession. It's actually something that every major society in the traditions that I've studied have done. It's not just capital, it's also the state. It's also territorial societies in their own way historically have produced these kinds of divisions. So the idea of expansion by expulsion broadens the idea of primitive accumulation in two ways. First, the process of dispossessing people of their social status, expulsion, in order to further develop or advance a given social form of motion, expansion, is not at all unique to the capitalist regime of social motion. We see the same social process in early human societies whose progressive cultivation of land and animals, a kind of territorial expansion with the material technology of fencing, also expelled through territorial dispossession a part of the human population. This includes hunter-gatherers whose territory was transformed into agricultural land, as well as surplus agriculturalists for whom there was no more arable land left to cultivate at a certain point. Thus, social expansion is the condition of social expulsion is the condition of social expansion in two ways. It's an internal condition that allows for the removal of part of the population when certain internal limits have been reached. The carrying capacity, how many people can reasonably live, survive, farm, etc. in a certain area permanently. And it's an external condition that allows for the removal of part of the population outside those limits when the territory is able to expand outward into the lands of other groups, other hunter-gatherers, for instance. In this case, territorial expansion was only possible on the condition that part of the population was expelled in the form of migratory nomads, forced into the surrounding mountains and deserts. So when I say all this, I'm thinking about Paleolithic and Neolithic humans and the transition to kind of more settled forms of agriculture. We later see the same logic in the ancient world, whose dominant political form, the state, would not have been possible without the material technology of the border wall that both fended off enemies and held them captive as slaves, a large body of barbarians through political dispossession, which is to say they lack any form of political voice or agency in those ancient societies. You can think of Egypt, you think of Greece, Rome, massive slaveholding societies in the ancient world, as enemies and held as captive. And then continually stolen, kidnapped, migrants from the mountains in the Mediterranean. So the colonialism, so the social conditions for the expansion of a growing political order include warfare, colonialism, massive public works, where precisely the expulsion of a population of barbarians who had to be walled out and walled in by political power. So not only that they were expelled from their existing territories, but then they were kidnapped, stolen, recruited into militaries, and then used as slave labor to reproduce those ancient societies. So this technique occurs again and again throughout history. And I've tried to describe this at much longer length in my books. The second difference between previous theories of primitive accumulation and the more expansive one I offer in this description of Keynote politics is that this process of prior expulsion or social deprivation noted by Marx is not only territorial or juridical, and its expansion is not only economic. Expulsion does not simply mean forcing people off their land, although in many cases it may include this. It also means depriving people of their political rights by walling off the city, criminalizing types of persons, by cellular techniques of enclosure and incarceration, or restricting their access to work by identification and checkpoint techniques. Yes, so there's definitely a lot more to say about this process of expansion and expulsion. I think that I should probably jump ahead to my sort of case study at the US-Mexico border, so we make sure we have time for some discussion. So yeah, maybe I'll just jump ahead. And this is kind of the second thesis, really a combination. The case study looks at a combination of the second and third thesis, which is in studying borders, I don't think that it's maybe the most productive way to analyze borders as just stopping human movement. Most borders, and this varies, of course, geographically, there's way more complicated things going on than just people who get to the border and then stop. I mean, what happens after they stop and they can't pass, right? I mean, what is the life and what is the process of being stopped by borders, living at borders, being pushed back to other places, being deported back before a border and then attempting another border cross. So the way that I've thought about borders and looked at them in the case of the US-Mexico border is, I'll give some examples, is to kind of study the patterns of motion. So this is part, there's a larger project here of thinking about the philosophy of movement and motion in all these different aspects of society and art, aesthetics and sciences and ontology and all these other things. But in its political manifestation, looking at the patterns of motion means looking at what happens at borders, the way that borders actually kind of facilitate a certain kinds of circulation, which is to say they don't function only to stop people. I think mostly they don't really function to stop people. Mostly their goal is to distribute or recirculate, to sort of change the way that people move instead of just simply stopping their movement, which nobody ever stops moving. So it does raise all kinds of questions about what exactly is going on. So those are the two theses, is that the borders are really kind of about recirculating, that migrant positionalities are related to the ways in which borders recirculate and redistribute. So let me give an example in the case of the US-Mexico border. The US-Mexico border does a lot of things. It kills people. It's killed over 6,000 people at this point since 1994. It is enormous graveyard filled with bodies. It is a money-making machine. It is an environmental catastrophe. It's all of these things. But if you look at the patterns of motion, and there's a couple that I want to talk about, you can sort of see what's going on. One way that the border works is not to stop people actually, but to kind of to sort of criminalize and monetize the entire process, which is to say that the private companies that are contracted to build, repair, reproduce the wall are some of the same companies that are making money by people crossing that wall. So the statistics are at the US-Mexico border wall that up to 90-something% of migrants are able to cross on the third attempt, meaning that the wall it's not really stopping people. I mean, it's forcing people to do a lot of very dangerous things. The wall itself works to actually more performatively dramatize and criminalize the behavior of crossing the wall. but that has a bunch of other effects. So we can see a kind of circulation, a circuit in which migrants cross the border wall, so illegally. I mean, maybe possibly legally as well. I mean, most border crossers are legal ones, which is to say they're crossing on a visa of some kind, and they arrive in the United States and then overstay their visa. And then once they overstay their visa, then, you know, technically this is not, I mean, Trump made this like actually a procedural criminal process before it had not been a technically legal criminal process. But in any case, people overstay their visas, and then they get, you know, they're picked up or apprehended in some way by immigration's custom enforcement. So there's a structure to, I mean, so while they're working in the United States, they're hyper exploited. They're paid very low wages, if they're paid wages at all, sometimes completely unpaid. Their employers can structurally, you know, take advantage of them by paying them lower wages or paying them not wages or abusing them in various ways because of their precarious status, especially if their visas have fallen out of status. So they're economically exploited during the time that they're in the United States, reproducing, shaping that society, you know, being the constitutive parts of it that they are. Then they are at some point apprehended. So they become part of the criminal process. So there's a whole series of detention centers. And the detention centers, the goal of the detentions, these are private detention centers. There's an entire network of private detention centers. It's an enormous lobby in the United States, where they basically lobby to have increased legal regulation of immigration so that more immigrants end up in these detention centers. And while they're in the detention centers, the private centers are paid $200 per bed per night per migrant. Okay, so they're making a lot of money by keeping migrants there as long as possible. So you have absolutely enormous numbers of migrants that are being detained for having committed no crime, having only overstayed a visa, which historically had not been prosecuted as a crime in the United States. So they stay there for a very long time, and every day that they're aired, so up to a year without any criminal prosecution, they're never tried, they're never convicted. Only after about a year are they just then deported. So the private detention center is one stage of this circuit, right? So they pass the wall, they're criminalized just by virtue of passing the wall, or if they have a visa, then they're criminalized as soon as the visa becomes out of status. And then they're sort of hyper exploited by an economic situation that takes advantage of people without status. Then they're apprehended by a detention center or private detention that makes money off of them as being criminals. And then after that, they're deported by another private series of trucks and planes and helicopters. These are all a whole private industry that makes money off of just deporting migrants. And then deports them, so transports them and deports them back across the US-Mexico border, about 40 miles, you know, south of Tijuana or wherever the place is on the southern border, to which the migrants, many of them not from Tijuana or border towns, but from southern Mexico or even South America and Central America, decide to cross over again. They're not going to live in some random place in Mexico. They're going to cross over again, and then the circuit begins again. My point in describing this is to say that the border isn't really there so much to stop, although it might stop people or deter in some ways. It actually facilitates a criminalization process. It kind of acts as this performative geographical architectural structure that allows for a cycle of economic exploitation from a bunch of different parties. And the purpose is not to stop people. It's actually to keep them circulating so that they will cross again and come back to be illegally, and criminalized and then economically exploited and incarcerated. And then the cycle goes on and on and on. So anyway, that's one example which we could look at as a kind of a process of economic circulation. The way in which the border is a process of movement, really, that doesn't stop but circulates. Okay, so a couple examples that I want to highlight here is various patterns of motion at the border. One of those is a kind of centripetal collection of migrants. It's not that the border is somehow homogeneous and just is the same in every place and is always stopping people. It's the same in the case of Europe along the Mediterranean. There are spots where it's harder and easier to cross. And if that's the case, what's happening is the border is actually shaping the flows of migration by being more or less secured in various places. it's also it's not just shaping the flows, it's actually shaping the life chances of survival of people being able to even cross those borders. So for instance, the US-Mexico border, there are places where there's just simply no border. In the middle of the desert, places in Arizona and Texas, where it's just out in the middle of nowhere, many, many miles from town. In the United States, they call it the Devil's Highway. And they call it the Devil's Highway because there's no borders. And so what this does is it causes migrants to avoid places like El Paso, major cities where the immigration is, it's harder to cross a border wall. So they get funneled. And in the US government has a bunch of internal reports. They have, they write about this process. They have a name for it because they know it's happening, which is kind of horrifying because they know how many people are dying trying to cross it, but they call it the funnel effect. So the funnel effect is that it's harder to cross on the side, so people go toward the center, and it funnels migrants through this channel of the Devil's Highway, in which they're, subjected to incredibly low temperatures at night and incredibly hot temperatures during the day, and many die out there. And some of the bodies are recovered. There's entire graveyards in Arizona that are just unmarked bodies. Just unmarked piles of bodies that stack up, and some Catholic organizations have gone around. They put like little popsicle stick crosses in these piles of bodies. I mean, it's quite horrifying. And then as soon as if they discover the identity of one of the bodies that's been buried, I mean, they will actually dig up the bodies, these unnamed bodies, and if they find out who the person is, and they're not a citizen, they will then deport the body from the graveyard back to Mexico. Yeah, some of the pictures, I mean, a bunch of artists have done all these installations about this. In any case, my point is that it's not that the border is stopping, it's circulating, it's funneling people in these channels. We could look at various patterns in the Mediterranean and Europe as well, the ways that they're funneled. So that's one effect. One kind of kinetic effect that we could look at if we think about the border as this process of shaping patterns of circulation. So the other one, this is another term used by government reports themselves, is they call it the cage effect. And the cage effect is that once the funnel has kind of brought people in, the cage kind of locks them in, which is to say that if you make it very difficult and especially dangerous to cross the border, it means that once migrants cross that border, it becomes dangerous to return. Like if they want to go home and see families or return for any reason, they're hesitant. So if they overstay, so they're more likely to overstay visas and just remain in the United States because it's dangerous. They won't be able to get back in. If they cross and leave, not that they won't be able to get back in, but it might be dangerous. Either they might be apprehended, they might end up in incarceration, they might end up dead if they have to do this process again. So instead of coming back and forth, they just stay. And that's called the cage effect. But this is a structural pattern of motion that's produced by the border. Now, again, this is not the stated objective of the border. So if you look at all the rhetoric, so we should also think about the way that people talk about borders, especially states and politicians, when they say things like, we'll build a bigger wall to stop migrants, or we'll do this, that, and the other thing to like regulate migrants. It's like, look, you're not actually stopping, you're not able to control the flow of human bodies. You're able to modulate the patterns at which they move. But that's not the level of analysis that they typically do, or the kinds of things they typically say. They say the border is there to stop people. So then when it doesn't, the border fails, right? But it's not a question of success or failure. It's a question of how people are moving, how people are dispossessed, how people are being put in precarious situations and are dying on the borders. So those are maybe three patterns: the funnel effect, the cage effect, and then you have this kind of economic effect of circulating bodies and all the money to be made. I mean, in other words, the private companies that do this, I mean, they have an incentive not to stop migration. They have an incentive to keep migration happening. It's in their best interest to keep migrants moving. One, for economic exploitation, they just fuel these societies economically. And two, that they can, that they can make money through the whole incarceration, deportation, criminalization process. So there's way too much money to be made, and there's an entire industry that's just lobbying to have the laws be structurally set up so that they reproduce this whole structure in the first place. Okay, well, I'm gonna stop there. There's probably a lot more to say, but I'm gonna stop because I'm sure people have, lots of things to share, and different types of borders work and move in different ways. So yeah, thanks everybody.
Thank you. I supposed to give you 45 minutes and you just end 5 minutes earlier. So I think it's perfect. Actually, in our research project team, we have many scholars with different backgrounds, so including history, literature, economy, and sociology, but we are missing just one discipline, like a philosophy. So we had to depend on your idea. And personally, as a sociologist, I'm quite get used to the conceptual framework applying to contrasting concepts. So movement versus settlement, and host society versus sending society. And even though many sociologists love to use that metaphorical expression like a stranger is just a stranger, right? So when we were reading your books, that kinetic concept actually provided quite useful conceptual tool to blur these boundaries between settlement and migration. So yeah, thank you again for your excellent keynote speech, and I will open to the public to receive some questions. So anyone? Okay, Director Huang.
Thank you for your insightful presentation. And my Korean is far fluent than English. I ask in Korean. 감사합니다. 저는 선생님의 The Figure of the Migrant를 읽었습니다. 그리고 그 책에서 키노폴리틱스라는 개념으로 역사 속에서의 이주 현상을 이론적으로 분석해 주셨는데요. 정말 이론에 취약한 역사가로서는 아주 신선한 충격을 받았다는 표현이 맞을 것 같습니다. 굉장히 새롭기도 하고 어렵기도 했었습니다. 그리고 오늘 키노 스피치 역시 그 Figure of the Migrant 그 책에서 읽은 것처럼 들으면서 굉장히 인사이트풀한데 참 어렵다 이렇게 생각이 됐습니다. 저는 두 가지 질문을 드리고 싶은데요. 지금 사실 우리가 이 호모 미그란스라고 하는 표현을 쓰고 있습니다. 제가 알기로는 1971년에 스위스에서 처음으로 이 카툰집 이름이 호모 미그란스라는 책으로 나왔었던 걸로 기억을 합니다. 그리고 거기 카툰을 보면 아담과 이브로부터 시작을 해서 카툰이 맨 마지막에는 달나라에 가는 현대인까지의 그 카툰이 쭉 시리즈로 이렇게 실려 있었습니다. 그리고 여기 어떤 의미에서는 모든 인간은 이주민이라는 이런 의미에서 호모미그란스라고 하는 새로운 용어를 그때부터 사용했다고 생각이 됩니다. 아까 선생님께서 처음에 말씀하실 때 민주국가가 만들어지고 나서 그 마이그런트라고 하는 표현이 나왔다라는 이런 표현을 하셨는데요. 그래서 저는 이제 이주민이라고 하는 이런 그 관점에서 그 대척되는 개념인 정주민, 말하자면 정주주의 이런 표현이 어떻게 처음에 쓰이게 되었을까라 하는 이런 가벼운 어떤 질문을 먼저 드리고 싶고요. 두 번째는 선생님 그래서 맨 마지막 결론 부분에서 마이그레이션에서 무브먼트와 모빌리티라는 표현을 쓰셨어요. 그리고 거기에 더해서 키네틱 다이멘션이 더해지면서 인간 그 역사에서 사회사적인 어떤 이주의 컨디션을 더 잘 이해할 수 있다라고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 저한테는 상당히 이 개념이 무브먼트와 모빌리티라고 하는 이 개념이 사실 정확하게 이렇게 구분이 돼서 들어오지가 않습니다. 이걸 좀 설명해 주실 수 있는지 모르겠습니다. 감사합니다.
So would you answer now, or how about collecting more questions and you answer all together?
I'm not sure what she said, but it seemed like a lot there. So maybe I should try to answer that if you could, or somebody could translate a little bit for me.
Oh, so you couldn't hear the English translated speaking? Oh. Okay. So actually, just in the case, more Korean question, actually on the bottom, you can click the interpretation icon, and then you can choose the language. Because we are providing the interpretation now.
Okay.
So did you find the icon interpretation?
Oh yeah, I did.
Yeah. So by clicking the English.
So I didn't know that there was a button. I've never used that at the bottom before. Okay, sorry about that. But I see now that it's like a live translation. Okay, that's amazing.
You pretend to understand the Korean.
I just thought I was being polite. I'm sorry. I didn't know that I didn't know there was a button. Nobody told me to push a button. So
just for now, maybe I can brief. So our translator can provide the translation now, or should I? Okay.
So repeat again. 네, 굉장히 선생님 프레젠테이션 잘 들었습니다. 감사합니다. 그리고 저는 선생님의 The Figure of the Migrant를 읽었습니다. 그리고 그 책을 읽었을 때 이론에 취약한 역사가로서는 그 책에서의 그 역사적인 이주 현상을 이론적으로 분석해 주셔서 매우 신선한 충격을 받았고 상당히 어려웠습니다. 이해하기가. 그리고 그냥 간단하게 그냥 질문으로 들어가면은요. 선생님이 결론 부분에서 마이그레이션에서 이제 세 가지 다이멘션이 있다고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 하나는 무브먼트, 그리고 하나는 모빌리티라고 말씀해 주셨고, 여기에 키네틱 다이멘션이 더해지면서 이주의 사회사적인 컨디션을 더 잘 이해할 수 있다고 말씀해 주셨습니다. 근데 저는 여기서 이제 무브먼트와 모빌리티라고 하는 개념에 대해서 정확한 이해가 되지가 않아서 선생님의 설명을 부탁드립니다. 감사합니다.
okay, I got it that time. I'm sorry the first time. I've never used this function before. Thank you to the translator. So that's like a live person who's there translating at the same time. Okay, amazing. Yeah, so thank you for your question, and thanks for reading the book and engaging with it. I'm glad that you found some things that were helpful in there. The short answer to this is that I don't really make a distinction between movement and mobility. For me, I mean, I know some theorists do. There's this migration scholar, Tim Cresswell, who makes a difference between mobility and movement and motion. And, to me, it's all, I mean, I don't use the words in any special way. They're the same for me. But yeah, I mean, maybe you disagree. Maybe you think there's a difference. But for me, I wasn't thinking of any big difference between the words.
Are there more questions?
예, 기조강연 잘 들었습니다. 저는 한성대 이주의 인문학 사업단 연구원인데요. 이주를 경계를 넘는 운동, 움직임으로 이주와 이 경계를 서로 연결해가지고 사유하는 것에 대해서 굉장히 설득력 있는 주장이라고 생각하고요. 제가 선생님의 강연을 제대로 이해했는지 잘 모르겠지만, 선생님의 여기 강연에서 제시하신 두 가지 태제에 대해서 질문을 드리겠습니다. 첫 번째 태제가 이주자와 경계는 국경은 사회적으로 구성된다. 그리고 두 번째 태제가 이주자의 위치의 다중성, 오늘날 이주자의 위치의 다중성은 직접적으로 경계의 다중성과 관련이 된다. 경계는 움직이는 것이기 때문이다. 이렇게 말씀하신 걸로 아는데, 지금 말씀하신 이 두 가지 태제가 강연에서 선생님이 말씀하셨지, 이주라는 것이 근대 역사의 산물이라기보다는 오래전부터 인간들이 이주해 왔고 경계를 넘어가는 운동을 해왔다는 점에서 지금 이 두 가지 태제가 이주의 보편적인 역사적 현상을 말씀하시는 건지, 아니면 지금 현재 우리가 바라보는 이주 문제에 한정된 건지, 제가 이해하기로는 보편적인 서구 역사, 고대 그리스 이래의 서구 역사에서 확인할 수 있는 것이라고 저는 생각이 되는데, 그렇다면 오늘날의 이주하고 그 다음에 인클로저 운동이라든지 고대 그리스의 식민지 운동이라든지 이러한 역사적 사건들의 차별은 어떻게 설명할 수 있는지, 그러니까 경계들이 달라진 걸로 설명할 수 있는지, 아니면 이주자들이 차이로 설명할 수 있는 것인지, 이게 좀 궁금합니다. 감사합니다.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's a big question. So this is the kind of the meat of figure of the migrant. The center pieces of the figure of the migrant is that it's a kind of typology of these different types. I mean, the short answer to your question is that all of the historical types that I've found are all present today. So it's at all of the parts, all of these different stages. And I mean, it's not that history is so cut up. It's that all of history follows along, that all of history is still in the present moment, that we never get rid of, we're never totally done with the things that happened in the past. And so many of the techniques of expulsion, the techniques of dispossession are still with us. There's a million examples that I could give, but I'll be very short about a few types of migrants. I do think that these types are pretty, I mean, migration does go back very far, certainly past even, ancient Greece, certainly to the Neolithic world. You asked the question of whether this is universal. Maybe I'd hesitate on universal, but I'd say pretty big, that humans have been migrating forever. And I think we just know much less about, for instance, like 99% of human history is Paleolithic hunter-gatherers. What do we know about their forms of migration? I think increasingly more than we used to, but still nothing like we do about, the Neolithic forward, and, ancient states and so on forward. We know a lot more about migration from there. One of the interesting things that we do know about Paleolithic migration is that it was much broader than we had previously thought. So recent research on Paleolithic migration is that it was much more cosmopolitan than we imagined. I think that the assumption was that hunter-gatherers just, stayed in one place and gathered and hunted during the Paleolithic. And recent archaeological evidence shows that they were much more mobile, traveling thousands of miles, and were in communication with other groups of people way more broadly than we ever thought before. But that also means that there were some kinds of networks of hospitality happening in the Paleolithic world. I was just recently reading a book in which they called it Paleolithic Cosmopolitanism. That's the term that was used by the authors to think about that period of time. So, I mean, that's, speaking of universal, that's 99% of human history, is that hunter-gatherers in some kind of cosmopolitan, far-ranging forms of movement and transport. Okay, now to your question about the different stages. There are different types of migrants in history. I'm just going to very quickly go through them, but there's the nomad, So nomads are sort of characterized by a territorial dispossession. So they're expelled from agricultural societies or have to live on the outskirts of increasingly sedentary agricultural societies. So that's one of the early forms of expulsion, is just of the territory, sort of land-based expulsions and exclusions. Next, in ancient societies, the techniques of migration, of producing migrants, the term was barbarians. So barbarians were just the term that the Greeks used for anybody who wasn't Greek. They're just barbarians, and barbarians were treated in a very specific way. They were territorially expelled from their homes, but they were also captured and brought in and turned into slaves. And so that's an addition that hadn't happened before. So that's a new stage of migration. So each historical stage that happens, the techniques of producing and reproducing migrants they keep going, like they build on each other. So they're additive and historically. So as history goes on, these different stages are added. They don't fall away, they don't disappear, they get sort of built up. So then the next technique is, at least again, my history and my background are European. So I'm kind of tracking this trajectory through the Near East, in the ancient world, and through, so this is these patterns might be different in the Americas during much older periods of time. They might in the East. I haven't done that research, so that's also why I hesitate on the universality about the figures of the migrant, because one can only study so much and have any kind of detail in history before it becomes so broad that you've lost all the detail. And it becomes too generic. In any case, the next stage is vagabondage, and that's the term is vagabond, and these are essentially vagabond laws that Marx and others describe at the time of sort of criminalizing, like creating laws against mobility. And that, again, you don't see that quite dramatically in the ancient world, but in the medieval world in Europe, you see all of these laws to criminalize vagabonds. Again, they're not called migrants, they're called vagabonds. So each of these terms I'm saying is all migrants, but they are, they have a very historical and geographical character to them. And then finally, the most recent one is the proletariat. So starting with the rise of capitalism, the specific word used to describe this group of people who move around, and their labor is not just politically expelled or juridically criminalized, it is economically exploited. And so that stage of or that period of history and that geography, that group of people are called the proletariat. And they are, they're one type of migrancy that is characterized by economic features.
So if there's no more question, actually, can I, adding to your answer, can I ask one more question? So to embrace this kind of historically different figure of migrant, including nomad, proletariat, vagabond, and barbarian. So I guess you chose migrant for now. So do you think, is there any particular reason, for example, compared to like a refugee? Nowadays, someone say that all we are refugee. So it has some nuance that we are maybe forced to become refugee because of political reason or economic reasons, right? So the other alternative terms also are there, and then they have more political nuance. But for me, migrant sounds more neutral. So I just wonder whether you have some special intention when you pick up the migrant.
Yeah, so this is a good question. I mean, I think there's one question is kind of, I don't know, really like conceptual and really broad historical. I mean, because when you're going back really far in history, refugee is not, I mean, it also has a very specific origin. That word refugee in English, at least, comes from Greek words meaning refugee, to sort of flee, refugium, in Latin, to kind of flee to some place of safety, that slaves were protected by various temples and so on. So the term refugee, I mean, politically, it's extremely divisive. I mean, you probably know how the rhetoric goes, but in Europe and United States, it's like really in Europe, and so there's a little bit more friendliness towards refugees, but like the category of what constitutes a refugee, I mean, it's a technical political category. It's a legal category. If then there's, to be designated as a refugee is not easy. You have to go through all kinds of applications to be a refugee. And sometimes there's just designations which do not yet exist for, like, climate refugees. We use that word, but as a legal designation in the United States, it doesn't exist. You can't apply to be a climate refugee. You can apply to be a political refugee, but you can't be a climate refugee. You can't be an economic refugee. Do you know what I'm saying? So, like, one idea, because that word in the contemporary period, as well as historical, I'm not sure if we would want to call Paleolithic peoples and nomads, if we wouldn't want to call them refugees, only because of the kind of the specificity of that word in Greek, but also the specificity of that word today. But there is a lot to, I mean, also there's something, one preference for the migrant is partly because of its generality. It is a bit more neutral because it describes a lot wider range of behavior and movement. Whereas refugee is maybe historically and contemporary like a subcategory of migrants. I also think that because refugees tend to be contemporary, in the contemporary period, refugees are treated by Europeans like refugees are okay. Those are people who legitimately have a reason to move, but migrants, no. Migrants, we do not want migrants. Europeans often, there's a whole discourse again in Europe where just they're not interested in migrants. And I think for that reason, it's actually quite important to emphasize migrancy and the historical breadth, the social importance, the constitutive nature of migrants, and not the constitutive nature necessarily of a smaller category of refugee, but the biggest possible category of migrancy.
Okay, thanks. So, no more questions? Okay, so now, yeah, one more. Is it okay? Okay.
네, 발표 잘 들었습니다. 제가 우리 선생님의 발표를 제대로 이해했다면 결국은 국민국가, 네이션 스테이트가 먼저 있고 그 다음에 마이그런트, 이주민들이 생겨난 게 아니라 역사적으로 보면 이주민이 선행하고 먼저 있고 그 다음에 이후에 스테이트가 생겨났고 그 다음에 그 스테이트가 생겨남으로써 시티즌이 생겨나고 그 시티즌과 더불어 보더가 생겨났다라는 게 이게 논리적인 흐름인 것 같고 저는 거기에 전적으로 동의를 합니다. 그 두 번째 이제 태제가 결국은 현재의 그 국경, 보더라는 것이 사람을 스타핑, 막는 것보다는 머니 메이킹, 돈을 만드는 그런 사업이 되어버렸다라는 게 선생님의 주요 논지인 것 같습니다. 제가 질문을 드리고 싶은 것은 그래서 결국은 마지막에 던지고자 하는 결론이 뭔지에 대해서, 예를 들어서 지금 선생님의 글의 마지막 부분의 제목이 Removing Borders, 국경을 없애자는 얘기인데 이 Removing이 여기서 정말로 리터럴리 문자 그대로 국경을 없애서 오픈 보더로 가는 식으로 바꾸자라는 얘기인 건지 아니면 그냥 심볼리컬리 상징적으로 조금 더 우리가 더 관용적인 그런 사람들이 되자라는 얘기인지 그게 removing border라는 말을 가지고 무슨 의미로 사용하셨는지 좀 궁금하고요. 만약에 국경을 없애는 쪽으로 가자라는 식으로 만약에 얘기를 한다면 결국 신자유주의라는 거, 니오리버럴리즘이라는 것이 결국 국경을 초월해서 자본과 인력, 다음에 자유로운 이동이 결국 신자유주의의 가장 전형적인 특징인데, 그럼 결국 교수님은 그런 신자유주의적인 정치경제 체제의 확장에 대해서 결국 동의하시고 계시는 건지, 큰 흐름에 있어서 그 두 가지가 좀 궁금해서 여쭙고 싶습니다.
Thank you. Yeah, I do not happen to agree with the neoliberal thesis, but you're absolutely right. I mean, so yeah, it's the title at the end, removing borders. Maybe there should have been some parentheses around the "re" there, because the idea is to change the way that things move, not necessarily to abolish. I mean, I don't even know what it would mean to abolish all borders. There's just too many kinds of borders, right? I mean, there's so many types of borders that to like remove them, it's just, there's not really something recognizable as, you know, societies at this point if there's no borders, like not even fences. So by expanding the definition of, so this is another thing. I mean, this is really actually a whole, it's a great question. It's really a whole other talk about open borders and what that means, and some of the problems and criticisms about open borders. But you're absolutely right that, and I'm certainly not in favor of, I mean, so one of the dangers about open borders is that it is part of a kind of historically capitalist and neoliberal discourse about free trade and so on. And that is partly what that would serve, is opening and abolishing all borders would essentially open and make vulnerable, especially less wealthy countries and states to be exploited economically, when there's already not enough protections to protect other countries from neoliberal exploitation and colonialism. If anything, those kinds of borders need to be strengthened, and those kinds of protections need to be put in place to protect countries. So the democratization of borders, that's closer to what I think. That various borders, I mean, maybe some kinds of borders might be removed, but I think the overall message here would be, and again, it's a whole other paper topic to which I only sort of gesture at the end of this one, is that the democratization or the control, people's own control over their own borders, is important. But the other thing to say about borders too is that just opening borders might have this have a very specific effect at this point in history, without the abolition of capitalism. So I mean, that would be my position kind of larger, is that like, it's not clear to me that too much headway is going to happen with this problem currently of global migration, unless capitalism itself is abolished, because it is one of the main mechanisms of producing this effect of global asymmetries, distributions of wealth inequality, and migration inequality. So abolishing borders and keeping capitalism, you know, that's you're just stoking the capitalist process. And in fact, what's happening is like, you're actually sort of, I mean, what would happen is more migrants, you know, I don't think it would be a total disaster in the sense that people imagine, oh, everybody would move. It's like, well, not everyone would move, but there would be an increase of movement. And what it would essentially do is an increase of movement from poorer countries to more wealthy countries. It's a kind of drain. It would suck and steal away and not actually change any of the conditions of expulsion in the first place. All it would do was increasingly dispossess people. So I very much worry about just abolishing borders, keeping everything else. So I think this is why this is a big question. It's a whole other paper talk, you know, a conversation to be had about a transition to a more open bordered world, but not the abolition of borders, and certainly not keeping capitalism as part of any future equation involving borders. But, you know, like I said, there's so many types of borders. The key thing is that they be sort of democratized, that they be open to the people who want to use them to protect themselves. That to me is important and needs to be maintained, and more importantly even is to protect at this point from neoliberal capitalism. But yeah, thank you for your question. It's a very good point.
So I think now we need to wrap up this session, and it's really honor to have you as our keynote speaker, and truly sorry to wake you up in this late night. So I will expel you, right? So now you can go to bed. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.
Good.